Ways in which premises can fail at acceptability. Ways in which you would say that this premise is not acceptable to you. And the first is the easiest. Some premises are easy to refute because they're simply and obviously wrong. So if someone made the claim that Sona Sotomayor is the first woman nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court, that would be easy to refute just by mentioning the names of Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So easy refutability is simply when the claim is wrong, one can make one or two statements showing that it's wrong, and you're done. Much more difficult, and this is one of the few times where you have to look at the structure of the argument with regard to acceptability. And that's in the case where premises contradict each other. That is, in the context of a single argument, an arguer can't make two premises that are necessarily opposed to each other and expect both to be deemed acceptable. So let's consider the question of legalization of marijuana. Some person might make the argument that marijuana should be legalized because one reason is because it has little to no physiological effects. It's a fairly benign substance. It doesn't really change much of anyone's personality or cognitive abilities. And then they might also make the claim that marijuana should be legalized because when one uses marijuana early in the day, one is a much more productive, happier person, and therefore it would maximize the happiness of more people. Now these two claims are contradictory. If marijuana has little to no effect, it cannot therefore have a positive effect. It has to be one or the other. Now, when you're faced with premises that contradict each other, you've got a couple options. You're well within your rights to reject both of them without looking too much further, saying you can't have access to either one of those premises. I think a slightly better approach is to accept the premise that is more plausible for the moment, reject the less plausible premise, and then reconsider the one that's left. So in the marijuana example, one could say, which is more likely, that marijuana does have a significant effect or that marijuana doesn't have a significant effect? Reject the one that you find least plausible and then reconsider the one that's left. Okay. Premises can also lack clarity. Sometimes you've worked on an argument, you've rephrased the premises as best you can, and you still don't have a clear idea what they're saying. It's just not clear. It can be not clear in a variety of ways. The claim may be overly vague. Professor X is a good professor. Good in what way? Good at what part of professor's job? It's very vague. It's hard to even know what that claim actually means because the language is so general and so imprecise. Another way in which claims can lack clarity is by being ambiguous. So you might see on a recommendation the claim, I can't tell you how many times this person saved a project from near and utter ruin. Well, that claim could actually have two distinct meanings. I can't tell you how many times that person saved a project because it never happened once, which is the reason I can't tell you of exactly one. Or it happens so often that I can't tell you how many times it is. So any claim whose clear content you cannot isolate, you cannot tell exactly what is meant by that, you should reject out of hand. Okay, premises can depend on faulty assumptions. So if someone were to say to you, you really shouldn't take this class because it has tons of group work, okay? The assumption there being is that you're not good at group work. So if the class has a lot of it, you shouldn't take the class. But that may be a faulty assumption. You may have to say to your friend, actually, you may not know this about me, but I'm great at group work and it's my preferred method of learning. So any claim that rests on a faulty assumption, whether that assumption is explicitly or implicitly articulated, should itself be rejected. Claims can emanate from a biased source. So, the Illinois state legislature passed some legislation calling Springfield, Illinois, the chili capital of the world. So the legislature made a claim. Springfield, Illinois is the chili capital of the world. Makes the best chili out of everywhere, okay? Now, when I look at that claim and I say, now, do I accept this? is Springfield, Illinois really the chili capital of the world? I have to take into consideration who is making this claim. The Illinois legislature is not an expert on chili. What they are an expert on is managing PR for their state. And what their real purpose is in passing some legislation that calls Springfield the chili capital of the world is making sure people will come visit. So I'm going to reject that claim, especially given that it sounds pretty unlikely. My guess is that Springfield, Illinois is not, in fact, the chili capital of the world. Okay, this is one of the very few fallacies that I'm going to talk about in these 10 steps. Fallacies are nothing more than common patterns of logical error that crop up with persistence, and they crop up repeatedly in many of our arguments. Many critical thinking classes spend a lot of time talking about the dozens and dozens of fallacies that philosophers have given names to. I don't spend a lot of time on that because these 3 questions that we're going through right now, if you apply them correctly, you'll find every single fallacy that philosophers have ever talked about. But I'll use the term for this particular fallacy, which is called begging the question. This is a fallacy whereby the premise, rather than leading you to the conclusion, rather than giving you a reason to accept the conclusion, actually already assumes that the conclusion is true. That the premise couldn't even be articulated unless the conclusion is true. This is not the same as the premise and the conclusion being in some ways consistent. It's that the premise actually already assumes the conclusion. Here's an example. If someone wanted to convince you that you really should drop everything you're doing and join the fight against climate change, they might say something like this. Look, this is really serious. Climate change is really serious. If you don't do something now, your kids are going to be angry at you 20 years from now. That's why you should do it. So here's the premise. Your children will be angry in 20 years if you don't do this. Therefore, either, let's take the form of what I'm thinking right now, climate change is very serious, or you should do something about it. But here's a reason to believe that it's serious. Your children will be angry in 20 years. The problem with this claim, your children will be angry in 20 years if you do nothing, is that it doesn't prove that climate change is serious. It assumes that it's serious. The conclusion is already sort of embedded in the premise, which is not logical. The conclusion itself has to emanate from the premises. It can't already be embedded in there. Okay, as I said before, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the patterns that you could keep an eye out for as you determine whether premises are acceptable or not acceptable. Now I want to return to something that I mentioned a little earlier on, which is that you actually have 3 options when it comes to acceptability of premises. You've got 3 decisions, 3 kinds of judgments that you can make. 1, you can call a premise unacceptable and then explain exactly why you're making that judgment. 3, you can say, no, I accept this premise. I hold it to be true, and tell me why. Now, keep in mind, the explanation is crucial here. If you say this is acceptable because my mom says it is, that's probably not a great reason to accept a premise, depending on what the premise is and depending who your mom is. You have to back your judgment up. I usually say to students, like 2 or 3 steps beyond what you think is reasonable before philosophers will consider it to be substantial.